Welcome to Wes Young Writer, an audio blog by me, Wes Young. The essay-style reflective writings of a blog offered here in the convenience of audio form. Find more at wesyoungwriter.com. This episode is entitled Response to Joseph Campbell, posted January 2025. I've just finished reading Joseph Campbell's seminal book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, published in 1949. This is my second experience with Campbell, the first being the Bill Moyers interviews on PBS, first aired in 1988. You can find my response to the PBS interviews on my YouTube channel at Wes Young Writer in a recorded sermon entitled Metaphors, Mythology, and a Living God. My explanation of and reaction to The Hero with a Thousand Faces is offered now, here, in AudioBlog form. To be clear, I know that Joseph Campbell is not a lone figure, but is more like a spokesperson, a synthesizer and popularizer of the thoughts of many who came before him. If I use Campbell's name as a representative or proxy of a larger cloud of witnesses, it is one, for convenience, and two, because Campbell happens to be the one I'm familiar with, happens to be the book I just read. Anyway, here goes. The Gospel according to Joseph Campbell runs something like this. Before the beginning was the void. It was one. It was beyond comprehension, not that there were any people around to comprehend it, and beyond expression, not that there were any mouths or languages to try and express it. Then the void became manifest, became the waking creation of space and time, the cosmos and all it contains. In doing so, the one became the many. It was now both manifest and manifold, this over here, that over there, planets, suns, moons, fish, lizards, people, and so on. In terms of our human sense of time, this process took quite a while. Even just one chapter of this grand story would be billions of years. For instance, the evolution from fish to lizard to monkey to man required billions of laps around the sun. But the void, capital V, was, so to speak, not in a hurry. The void transcends time. This next bit is where Campbell really focuses his work. At some point along the journey from primate to person, the human or nearly human brain began to sense vaguely its origin. Where did all this come from? Where did we come from? These inklings were buried deep in the human subconscious, a place that would remain unrecognized, shrouded in mystery, until the far more highly evolved species could produce the likes of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, to explain it to the other bipeds. From these mysterious depths came the echoes of the void, the first intuitions, it would be going too far to say understandings, of origin, first cause, transcendent truth. The problem, though, was that the void was and always will be beyond comprehension. Thought cannot carry it, and beyond expression, language cannot contain it. Therefore, mankind, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, and sometimes as a combination of both, developed myth, symbolical stories and images that presented the invisible subconscious and the inarticulate void in concrete narrative form. There were, and are, endless variations, the thousand faces, of this narrative, but all, Campbell assures us, were and are telling the same story, capital S, what he calls the monomyth. Tales of Father Sky impregnating Mother Earth, or a giant egg hatching into the cosmos, or a creator saying, "Let there be light," all were secondary symbols. All these tales and stories were secondary symbols of the single same underlying thing. These stories did and do their work. But also from them, Campbell explains, there rises an important and unfortunate, for him, complication, one that plagues mankind to this day. Many people, not knowing any better, miss the critical point that the myths, the stories, were and are merely symbols, that the inexpressible thing is beyond and above them. Instead of looking through the myths, simple-minded folks instead look at the myths. They actually believe, for instance, that Abraham led Isaac up the mountain, that Jesus really was transfigured on a mountain, that a heavenly Father does actually hear our prayers. And if my examples here are all Christian, it is because Campbell himself mostly focuses his debunking right there. Presumably, any religion is capable of mistaking the symbolic secondary things for the actual final things, but apparently Christians are most in need of Campbell's smelling salts. Anyway, and getting back on track, the world became populated with myths of all kinds. Telling these stories and participating in their accompanying rituals has for thousands of years aided mankind's survival, giving them a sense of community, purpose, and belonging. And even though, Campbell explains, folks like Freud and Jung have now cracked the code concerning the actual source of the myths, namely the inner electricity of our brains, we humans are hurting ourselves, Campbell says, when we neglect the role of myth in our lives. Ancient peoples benefited from myths, not knowing why. We moderns can still benefit from myths, knowing why. It's like the ship captain who gave his crew limes based on some vague intuition, not knowing why. Then, after scientists discovered, named, and explained scurvy, still the captain gives them limes, now just knowing why. Or like the old woman who calls her husband in from the field when her knee aches, knowing nothing at all about atmospheric pressure. And even when some meteorologist comes along and explains barometers to her, still she knows a rain is coming when her knee aches. Only now she knows why, if you call being able to repeat terms like barometric pressure knowing. Our modern understanding, if you can call it understanding, of the subconscious helps us understand why and how the myths help us. But, Campbell says, they help us just the same. Also, he argues, it hardly matters which myth, so long as we have myths and let them guide us, some way or another, through the monomyth. Yes, the gospel according to Campbell, in its shortest form, is that all branches lead to the same trunk. That any mythology or ritual will do, as long as it convinces us of and prepares our hearts for the transcendent void that we all sprang from, and that we will all finally disappear into. That final denouement of our death, when our fantasy of an individual self dissolves into the nebulous nothing, like a raindrop in the ocean or a fart in the wind. I hope I have captured accurately the Campbellian worldview. Now, what do I make of it? Is he possibly right? Could all of us who have given our lives to a deity actually have mistaken the symbolic for sacred, thinking our religions are actually articulating that which is inexpressible? I'll say this. If Campbell has made a good point about the final fundamental, capital F, at least he has made it by using nothing better than what he tells me not to use too seriously, that is, words, symbols. If Campbell really has seen past, seen through all the mere representations of religion, he can only tell us about it using, well, mere representations. Be honest, folks. When you hear the term transcendent void, don't you immediately picture a black hole suspended in outer space? And do you see what just happened? Hole, space. These words bring us right back to the world of symbols and representations. In short, to the world of myth and language. whereas Campbell seems to have done something truly novel, new, and different, something beyond mere religious iconography, he has really only offered us the same sort of thing we already had. It would be like Moses leading a 40-year hike through the desert, only to bring the people back to Egypt, insisting that this is the promised land. At least Jack got magic beans for his old cow, but here Campbell takes our old cow and gives us just another old cow, one more broken down than Milky White. Campbell takes our symbols for and words about God, and he trades them for symbols of and words of his own. And his words and symbols are even less adept. At one point in his book, for instance, he refers to what we've been calling God as really an energy. And immediately the mind pictures power lines and dynamos and arcs or sparks, all metaphors. And not one of them half as useful as our Father in heaven. Now, in that previous sentence, did I just concede the crucial point that our Father in heaven is a metaphor? Great question. I have 3 points in response. Number 1, there are 2 sorts of metaphors. One is creatively conjured up to help express some abstract, invisible, intangible. If I say my heart is heavy, I'm calling on physical things like gravity and lead weights to convey the non-physical tenor of sadness. It seems that these sorts of metaphors are, in a sense, arbitrary. Any old weight will do, a big rock or a large bucket of water, so long as you eventually get your listener to understand that you are sad. Side note, I may be wrong about that, by the way. It is possible that everything is charged with divine import, and nothing, not even these imaginative metaphors, are arbitrary. Maybe there is some connection between heavy weights and heavy hearts that goes beyond mere picture painting. I don't know, and I get ahead of myself to even bring it up. But the second type of metaphor is certainly just that. Not arbitrarily or imaginatively chosen, but deliberately formed from a template. It's the difference between a man in his workshop saying, "Go get me a shim about the thickness of a pencil," and that same man saying, "Go get the key that fits this lock." The pencil was just convenient for communication. He could have said a Pop-Tart or a peanut and been just as well off, but the key, it was made with the lock in mind, and no other shape will do. These second types of metaphors are perhaps not metaphors at all, but archetypes and the products of archetypes. Not arbitrarily chosen for the convenience of communication, but deliberately fashioned from a template that exists in the immaterial, transcendent realms, the shadows and copies of heavenly places. Presumably, a sad heart did not invent weights and gravity any more than a shim invented a peanut, but it is quite possible, Christians believe it is so, that the Creator made mankind in His image. It's not like God, the invisible Creator, said, "All right, I want them to see me, so I'll make myself look like them so they can, understand it." I mean, this is at least a step in the right direction for those who think from top to bottom that man created, that is, made up God. But still, this idea, while at least granting a sentient creator being, misses the point about archetypes. Erroneously thinks that the shadow dictates the shape of the thing that cast it, when the truth is the other way around. Not God saying, "Let me make myself in their image so they can understand me," but instead God saying, "Let me make them in my image so they can understand me." The implications of this are far-reaching, but I'll stick to the one that started this part of the discussion. Our Father in heaven. Is that a metaphor? If it is a metaphor of the second archetypal sort, and that makes all the difference. "Let us make man in our image," said God in Genesis. And so He made man to have children. Male and female, he created them. In other words, God created the father-son relationship, and he did so based off the template of some divine truth in some heavenly realm. Calling God our Father is not merely some convenient choice creatively conjured up by ancient theologians seeking to anthropomorphize God, but is instead a deliberate creation, like a key to a lock, that reflects something fundamental about God's nature. And if a creator exists at all, it should not surprise us that he is capable of casting an honest shadow, talented enough to trace his own template, skilled enough to shape his own key. Number 2, the anthropomorphic impulse of mythology, that is, envisioning God shaped something like a human, is the grand revelation Campbell feels he has exposed. Not that he dislikes humanoid images of God, so long as they keep their place in the realm of myth, his bread and butter. But the grand insult in his mind is the persistent tendency of believers to take the anthropomorphized symbol as the thing itself. Well, for one thing, in response to this, Christians don't actually clutch the image as firmly as Campbell seems to think. The second of the 10 Commandments, God's mandate against graven images, is one obvious moment, and it couples nicely with such verses as Colossians 1:15, the invisible God, Romans 1:20, God's invisible qualities, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17, the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God. Christians, as it turns out, say simultaneously and with a straight face that God sees us, eyes, and hears us, ears, that he smells our incense with his nose and holds us in his hand, and that also he is invisible. This is the not oxymoronic paradox of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27, which says that Moses, quote, persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He saw him who is invisible. It is not at all difficult for me to think of an invisible God making himself visible to the very eyeballs that he created. Whereas it is downright impossible for me to conceive of a God powerful enough to let there be light and to fashion eyeballs that can receive and perceive it, but who is somehow incapable of making himself visible in that light when he wants to. It would be like Edison inventing the bulb, but somehow not skilled enough to flip the switch. But all that is just the quick answer to Campbell's anthropomorphic complaint. The deeper answer comes in the form of a question. Why, Mr. Campbell, cannot an anthropomorphic image be, in fact, accurate? Why cannot God, in some fundamental archetypal way, actually be something that is most accurately represented by eyes and ears, nose and hands? And working from that template, he made us for himself. I know why. It's because this making us, this working from a template, means that God would have to be a personality. And that is something that a void cannot be. It would mean that God has a will, makes decisions, is proactive, and these are things that a void cannot do. All through his book, Campbell wants to pretend that what you call God is just a different word for the same thing, capital T, that he's talking about. In the same way that if I say, the man who lives in the third house on Peter Street is also my great uncle, is also Ralph. Different labels, same guy. But no, I'm afraid I must call Campbell to the carpet on this hat trick. If words mean anything, then what I mean when I say God is not at all what Campbell means when he says void. The one is a personality that can love and be loved. that can be talked to and will talk back, that can be pleased or disappointed. The other is more like the Force in Star Wars. It can be tuned into, at best, but it certainly doesn't think anything. As scientist and atheist Dr. Carl Sagan puts it, quote, "If by God one means the set of physical laws that govern the universe, then clearly there is such a God. This God, however, is emotionally unsatisfying. It does not make much sense to pray to the law of gravity." End quote. Number 3, Joseph Campbell's insistence on the inexpressible nature of the great void, the transcendent whatever, the origin force, is actually the resultant fruit of his belief in the inadequacy of words. Or to put it another way, he begins all of his thinking with the a priori assumption that language is man-made, a series of grunts that increased in complexity over the eons. But why is he granted this assumption unproven from the get-go? It's an important question to face, because everything he builds is constructed on this cornerstone. Early mistakes in any argument, just like early mistakes in any journey, affect all that comes after. I don't simply mean that he is 1 degree off at the start and he hits Africa instead of Amsterdam. His error on the adequacy of words is more fundamental even than that. And Campbell's intellectual prowess, his seamanship, deserves more credit than that. He is a man who sails due east with great precision, except that he thinks he's launched his boat in the North Atlantic, but unwittingly set off in Lake Huron, missing the whole of the prime meridian. Campbell is spot on that words, if they are nothing more than highly evolved grunts, would never be able to express or contain or even come close to the mystery behind the cosmos. But Campbell has run aground if in fact words are something else entirely, which is what I believe. Language is more primal than primate. It is not something that tries to explain the great mystery, capital M, but rather language is the great mystery. Christians believe that language existed before there were any human mouths to speak it or human ears to hear it. In the beginning, God, says the book of Genesis. And what is the first action verb we see God doing? Skipping over, as I do, God's hovering over the waters, which for all intents and purposes seems more of a state of being than an action. The first action is talking. You hear that? Talking. And God said. And did you know there's one other book in the Bible that starts with that same phrase, in the beginning? It is the Gospel according to John, and its opening sentence sends us down a very different boat ramp than Mr. Campbell. Quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So again, if language is nothing but complex grunts, then sure, the word Father, along with any images it conjures up, can only be a man-made symbol, a type 1 heavy-hearted metaphor. But if language itself is divine, then who can put limits on the weight it is capable of carrying? I have one last point to make by way of conclusion. It seems to me that Joseph Campbell's vision of all the myths, religions, etc. being just different facets of the same diamond, different paths up the same mono-myth mountain, different faces of the same hero, is primarily the result of his commission of a simple fallacy of fundamental logic, namely that just because two entities have some things in common does not mean that they necessarily have all things in common. A piano and a QWERTY both have keys. A guitar and a cheese slicer both have strings. An accordion and a missile silo both have buttons. But their resemblances end there. Two religions both have a teacher washing his followers' feet. But that hardly means that the two religions are the same. As G.K. Chesterton jokes, what other part of the body would you expect to be most dirty? Two narratives both have a hero descend into a cave, but that hardly means that they are the same story. One may descend for gold, the other to find the center of the earth. A third hero might descend into the cave because he believes the world is upside down and he alone has sense enough to walk, as he calls it, up to the, as he sees it, surface. Two histories include a global flood, but they are not, for that reason, equal histories or equally accurate. As with any history, there is the original event, which falls into time like a rock into a river, and from this center the concentric ripples grow, running away in all directions, and bent, too, by the ceaseless current of the river. The ripples may resemble one another, but no two are the same ripple, and some are in fact closer to the origin than others. If the whole world flooded, it should not surprise us that the whole world is filled with flood stories. It might surprise us very much if in the endless diaspora of humanity across thousands of miles and thousands of years, all cultures managed somehow to keep their diluvian records perfectly aligned. Perhaps the rock dropped in the river is what Campbell calls the monomyth, and that would be to his credit. But I think instead he believes only in the ripples, without the original rock. Or, if there is a rock, it was made, somehow, by the ripples. The difference between his view and mine is that he sees two ripples that resemble, and he assumes that the one resembles the other or the other resembles the one. Whereas I would say that both resemble, perhaps even independently resemble, some other thing. If two mythologies include a global flood, it could mean that a fairy tale of a flood meets some subconscious need in the minds of mythmakers, or it could mean that once a flood actually happened. If 2 or 200 religions include, say, a virgin birth, it could mean that the human subconscious craves such a flavor, that the impossible fiction symbolically represents some inexpressible something in some useful way. Or it could mean that once upon a time, a virgin actually did give birth. Perhaps the 200 versions, or maybe just 199 of them, are echoes and ripples of the one actual event. The myth became fact, as C.S. Lewis terms it. If so, then some ripples will be closer to the center than others, and therein lies the use of all theological discussion and, for that matter, divine revelations. But more to the point here is what we find at the center of all the rings: the rock, cut out, but not by human hands.